innovative philanthropy has really caught the attention of the foundation. Both Brennan and Ebony and I have been talking about some exciting opportunities. The investment committee is looking at some opportunities. Come on in, nice to see you. And so I'm just delighted that Sarah happens to be schedule a visit into Charlottesville and is making herself available to really engage in a conversation with us. I'm going to let Sarah kind of introduce herself, explain, talk through her journey, and once, you know, as we get along, it'll be pretty informal. Folks should be comfortable asking questions or helping yourself to more coffee or water. And with that, welcome, Sarah, and thanks for being here.
Thank you. I'm so grateful for Prime's partnership with CACF, and I was telling Jan earlier, we'll work our way back to where Prime is today and tell you more about the donor advised funds that we've partnered with, but working with Jan and the CACF team has really been a delight from the beginning, even though we're doing something that's new to you. And not all donor advised fund sponsors have been so easy to work with. So I feel very grateful, and it's a wonderful excuse for me to be in Seaville while the Who's are so Jan asked me to start by kind of sharing my personal journey from my UVA days until now. But before I do that, it would be very helpful to me to know who else is in the room. So I'm hoping we can do a round robin of introductions, and maybe if you just tell me your name and your affiliation, like what organization you might work with, and what interests you about the topic that Jan sent out. So let's start.
Well, I'm Brennan, and here at the Community Foundation, and just really excited by this particular opportunity and some of the learning that we've gotten for the foundation.
Great. Ebony, Director of Programs here at CACF, and I am I'm in charge of our discretionary grants program, and just thinking about other ways that we can be of support in the community and make bigger impact.
Great.
Erica Vixilia with the Fountain Fund, and we're a fairly new organization that provides low-interest loans to formerly incarcerated people. And we're looking to be in many places. And so I have been trying to think about creative ways that we could seed loan funds in other communities, and actually had talked to Jan about, could you ever get a loan? I hadn't heard of Recoverable Grant, but I'm very interested in if that could work for us so that we can be in many other places.
Mm-hmm. Okay, awesome.
My name's Sanders. I'm on the board of CACF and on the investment committee here.
I'm Rick Richmond. I'm a local attorney and on the board of CACF.
Eric Henderson. We just figured that we had a small world connection, and I've been here for 3 years as the accounting manager.
Great. And I'm Katie Kling, and I'm the donor engagement manager.
And I'm Whit Broom, Professor Emeritus at UVA and member of the board, CACF.
And I think I remember you're an accounting professor.
That's
so
right.
I have to have my ducks in a row.
Good break.
I'm Eric Johnson. I'm a past chair of CACF, and I work for a multifamily office here in town, and we are involved in all kinds of philanthropy and grant making, and this is right in an area of high interest for clients and the foundation.
Terrific.
Sue Dickerson with Boys and Girls Clubs of Central Virginia. Just heard about recoverable grants a few weeks ago from Jan, and really interested in learning more.
Gwen Goodkin, I'm a longtime volunteer here at CACF.
I'm Deb Donnelly with the Southern Environmental Law Center, and we have a lot of synergies with the foundation in terms of our donors' interests in protecting the environment, and I think that our attorneys also have a lot of contacts with startup companies and those in solar industry or other areas that are trying to make a difference.
Diane Schmidt.
Oh my gosh!
Blast from the past. We'll get to that story later.
I'm going to include that as part of my personal story. Wow.
I serve on the audit committee here on the Community Foundation.
Of course you do.
But we go way back from Blue Moon days. Sarah was an intern with us when she was at UVA, and I'm here partly to support you, but also partly because I really think this type of grant making is the best type of grant making, and just interested to see where Prime is today versus 4 or 5 years ago when we spoke. So yes,
I'm gonna cry.
Wow, thank you so much for being here, everyone. Well, so I thought I would go, well, now that I know that you're here, I'm going to go back to, time travel back to 2003, when I was graduating from high school in a small rural community outside of Rochester, New York. And someone anonymously nominated me for a kind of nerdy high schooler award. I'd already gotten into UVA, and a celebrity judge on the selection committee for that award, his name is Arunas Chisonis, and he at the time was 3 years into having started a telecom company based in Rochester, New York called Paytech Communications. And that year, 2003, it was the second fastest rising technology company in North America. And so he was a bit of a business celebrity in that region. And as a celebrity judge on the selection committee for this nerdy high schooler award, he saw my resume and asked me to come intern at his telecom company. And I already had my waitressing job, and so I was like, I'll do it if I can work until 4, then make it to my waitressing job. And so sure enough, that this internship turned out to be just an incredible experience. Arunas, is a kind of trial by fire type of manager. He gave me jobs way above my pay grade, and at the end of the summer, he sat me down. He said, Sarah, I think that when you're graduating from UVA, my company is going to go public, and my wife and I care very deeply about energy and climate issues, and we would like you to help us set up a family foundation. And I was 18, and I said, I do not know what you mean. I said, what is going public? What is energy and climate? Like, what the heck is a family foundation? You mean you would have enough money to give money away? Like, what is this? And so I came down to UVA. And around the same time, Arunas met, I think he met Diane Miller, and so he helped me get an internship as kind of my work study while I was a student at UVA at the Blue Moon Fund. And so that is the place that I learned about how private foundations work. And I had a wonderful experience working with the Dianes. and kind of started to learn about philanthropy just as a category of activities that people do all over the world. And sure enough, as I was graduating from the Commerce School, I guess I went to the Commerce School so that I could take this crazy job if I decided that it was something I wanted to do. And so I studied finance and management at the Commerce School. And in 2007, when I was graduating, Arunas's company was acquired by a public company called Windstream, and he and his wife had a personal liquidity moment, and sure enough, wanted to form the Chisonis Family Foundation. And so after graduation, I moved right up to Boston. Arunas is an MIT alum, and MIT had just announced the MIT Energy Initiative. It made it one of the most active research universities in that subject area in the world at the time. It felt like the right place to do our landscape analysis of how one family could make the biggest difference given the unique value proposition of philanthropic capital in that cause area. And we set up the Chisonis Foundation very traditionally. Arunas and Pam are a little crazy, so they made me executive director on the grant making side, and they made me a trustee on the endowment, and I was 22. It was an incredibly humbling experience. But just an incredible learning opportunity. And from 2007 to 2010, one gap that we drew out of our landscape analysis was we found a lot of basic science and engineering research inside university labs that was going unfunded by government or corporate dollars. And so we made a commitment to make traditional grants to university labs for energy technology projects that held promise for vast reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And so it was, again, a very humbling position to be the grantor to some of the smartest technical minds in our country. But I got to know a very large community of researchers. And as those researchers started to form for-profit companies to carry forward their research ideas from the nonprofit domain to the for-profit domain, they came back to Arunas and me, and both looking for advice from a self-made technology entrepreneur, but also looking for equity investment into these for-profit companies. And so Arunas and Pam started making for-profit equity investments into early stage technology companies, but the money did not flow through their foundation. As you can imagine, that left me with a lot of questions. Both what's appropriate for someone in my position being paid with tax-exempt dollars, why are the decisions we're making using different criteria from the traditional venture firms that we are co-investing with into these early stage companies, why are the companies that could make the biggest difference on the social causes that we care about seem to be the worst fit for some of these traditional financiers. And so all of those questions led me to go back to graduate school. I applied to a really cool program at MIT that sits in the engineering systems division, but lets you pick a research advisor from any department. So I knew that I could spend 2 years. They pay you like a PhD student, even though it's only a master's program, which was meaningful to me. And I could write a very specific thesis. And the thesis question that I wanted to ask was, are there better financial vehicles for families that see for-profit investing as an important tool in their toolbox to achieve their charitable goals? And so I found a professor in the Sloan Business School. Her name is Fiona Murray. And I stalked her until she agreed to be my advisor. And in the past, she had studied all of the different variables that affect how science and engineering transitions from the nonprofit domain to the for-profit domain. And so the topic that I wanted to study was interesting to her and in her area of expertise. So she agreed to be my advisor. And then together, we just sat and read the tax code for a while. And I remember the day. I remember the day that I was in the Suffolk University Law Library that I read one specific piece of the code called Program-Related Investments. And when I read the code language, I said, you know, theoretically, this is exactly what our innovation economy needs. The primary purpose of an investment is charitable, and the investment would not be made but for the charitable purpose. That describes really difficult hardware innovation that could be hugely meaningful for the world, but is not a fit for a 10-year closed-ended venture fund. So I took it back to Fiona, and I was like, am I crazy? Could this be a new type of socially minded venture investing? And she said, I don't see any reason why not. Let's see how this tool has been used in the past. And I know Blue Moon has done a lot of this, I think. And so I wrote my thesis at MIT in 2012, just trying to write down all of the different types of ways that program-related investments, which is a tool primarily relevant for private foundations, how it had been used in the past, and proposing its use for early stage equity style investing for science and engineering innovation. And I was flabbergasted that was a thing, having served for a private foundation, and I had never heard of it before then. And I was like, the very risky investments that Arunas and Pam were making probably could have been done by the foundation. We just didn't know. And I was surprised that not many other philanthropic asset owners had used those tools. And so in parallel to publishing my thesis at MIT in 2012, I hosted a very small workshop with just around the same size group as this, with a few of the philanthropic organizations that I had worked with over the years at the Chisonis Foundation. And I just presented the data of how PRIs had been used. And I said, I think here are some capital gaps in science and engineering innovation that I am familiar with related to primarily energy technology, because it's the vertical that I'm most familiar with. And, you know, has anybody else thought about doing this? Has anyone else tried to do it? And based on that workshop, I got a phone call a few days later from a gentleman named Jesse Fink, and he's a real leader in philanthropy up in New England. He lives in Norwalk, Connecticut. He was the founder of Priceline.com. He's a big conservation funder. And he called me and he said, Sarah, I heard that you had a workshop and you're asking if anybody's been trying to do this, and I'm calling you to say that I have been trying to do it, and my attorneys and accountants are telling me not to. And he's like, you know, I agree with you that it could be a huge potential kind of innovative way to think about philanthropy. If I give you a grant, will you make this your full-time job? Make it easier for people like me. And of course, me, Sarah, grad student, was like, yeah, I want to keep working on my thesis. This is awesome. So he didn't give me enough money to make it a full-time job. But I went back to the Chisonuses and a few other philanthropists that were very friendly, and I said, will you match Jesse's grant? And so that ended up being the first 4 grants into what would become Prime Coalition. The first thing that I did was spend 9 months just traveling around and talking to hundreds of different types of philanthropists. So community foundations, large institutional foundations with a lot of professional staff, small family foundations with maybe no staff, individuals that didn't have a donor advised fund or a foundation, corporate giving programs, and I asked them similar questions, you know, do you know that we have capital gaps in our science and engineering innovation pipeline? Do you know you have these tools to step in and help fill those gaps? What would make you excited about that? What would be very difficult for your organization around that? And based on all of those conversations, I started accumulating this list of reasons that it wasn't going to happen. And so the list was like a mile long, and in my mind I put the barriers into 3 buckets. The first was educational. Not many philanthropists knew or had heard the words recoverable grant or program-related investment. They certainly didn't know just how acute the capital gap was for early stage ventures of a certain type. So that's educational. Operational, even if they knew both of those things, most philanthropic organizations are not organizationally structured to behave like a venture capital firm. And, you know, the deal sourcing, due diligence, structuring of terms of a for-profit investment, negotiation with co-investors and entrepreneurs, and then to be a value-added member of a board of directors for a early stage for-profit company, like that's just not what most philanthropic organizations are in the business of doing. So that's a huge, I tend to think that's like the most salient bucket of barriers. And then the last is perceived regulatory barriers. And so even if you got past all of that other stuff and you decide that here's a company that I want to support with a program-related investment or recoverable grant, then you're like, okay, I have to establish charitability or exercise expenditure responsibility, and what I have to prove is a counterfactual, that this investment wouldn't be made but for the charitable purpose. Like, that's really hard as any single actor. Your choices at the time were either to hire an attorney that could give you a legal opinion that wouldn't actually protect you from the negative penalties if the IRS decided later that it wasn't actually charitable. Or you could get a private letter ruling from the IRS for every single transaction, because earlier private letter rulings don't count as precedent. And even if it's a very similar transaction, right? And that's an expensive process. It's a process that takes so long that you probably missed your investment opportunity. The company founders have moved on and are now working at Apple. And so, you know, for all of these reasons, we thought that there was some very serious intermediation that needed to happen to try to bring all of those barriers down to zero and unlock the floodgates for neglected science and engineering innovators. And so I think Jesse, when he offered to make a grant, he thought he was investing in maybe like a white paper. And what he got was me coming back and saying, I think we need to start an organization. So we formed Prime as a 501c3 public charity in February of 2014. We formed it as a public charity for very specific transactional reasons that we now all understand better. I was saying to Jan earlier, it's easy to look back and it seems like a straight line, but at the time you're like, I think this is what's right. And we came up with a 3-phase, 10-year plan just focused on the cause area of climate change mitigation and just focused on the investment type of early stage technology innovation. I'll say now that I think the mechanics of what we've done could be applied to many different cause verticals and many different investment types. So I hope that we come back to that during our discussion here. And our goal is just to stay within our narrow lane lines and do a really thoughtful, excellent job at the framework around how we're doing it. So that we can share what we've done with others to replicate it in other areas. So our 3-phase, 10-year plan, the ultimate goal, and the way that we think is theoretically the correct way to support neglected climate opportunities, is a blended equity pool that can go earlier than anyone else is willing or able to go and be a lifetime supporter of the companies through exit, so you can maintain a position on the board and continue to advocate for the climate impact the whole through exit. The minimum fund size for that ultimate vision in our space to have a healthy portfolio of 10 companies is $250 million. And so we actually spent about 3 weeks doing the mathematical modeling around that back in 2014, and as soon as we shared it with about 4 people, we realized that people were like, nobody's ever done the transaction, you all have never raised a fund, what kind of companies are you talking about? So going from 0 to that was not in the cards. And so phase 1 and phase 2, we've now designed to kind of build our way back to that. Phase 1, which is now complete, the purpose was just to explore the boundaries of what you're allowed to do with charitable capital and try to check the boxes on all of the different transaction types that you can do from different types of charitable asset owners. That phase lasted from 2014 to 2018, and we did deal-by-deal investment syndication. So we brought together philanthropists, one company at a time, just through matchmaking. And I can talk more about the mechanics and what we learned.
So it was 1-to-1, it wasn't a pool?
There were multiple philanthropists in each transaction, but it was just into one company, and there were different ways that they could come into that company. And I'll talk more in a moment.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's great. I can talk more in a moment of how we whittled the whole universe down to the specific companies that fit our criteria. But it was our team that did that on the company side.
Single structure or multiple structures going into each of those?
I was going to see if there's a whiteboard. So in phase 1, on a deal-by-deal basis, there were basically 2 different routes to supporting companies. The first was for the philanthropist to buy the security that the company was offering, and for us, for early stage innovators, it's primarily convertible debt, safes, sometimes equity priced rounds. And what we would do as the nonprofit is provide a charitability memo if the person buying the security was a foundation that wanted to claim it as a program-related investment. And we did all of the work of documenting all of the different ways that the company significantly furthered charitable purposes. And we, the nonprofit, have an investment advisory committee of the 20 most active and historically successful traditional market rate investors from this sector that come together to enumerate exactly the reasons that the company will not otherwise be funded. And so we document that in our charitability memo, and that's what has been very helpful to those that are claiming direct investments as program-related investments. Thanks. So this is phase 1, deal by deal. So Prime is in the middle as a 501c3. What we said, we've got the luxury of starting from a blank sheet of paper, so we said, you know, what we really want to do is see everything that could reduce greenhouse gas emissions and whittle that list down based on what's having the biggest impact, what is most attractive to follow-on commercial investors that won't otherwise be funded. So those are our core underwriting criteria and have been from day one and will be all the way through phase 3. So in most years from 2014 to 2018, we looked at between 1,500 and 3,000 companies annually, just based in the US. So, and that's everything across energy, agriculture, waste, and water. Anything that touches greenhouse gas emissions, it was in our registry.
How many people?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Talk to my husband about that.
Well, good to see you're still married.
Okay, so then you can imagine in phase 1, we would have usually around 5 companies annually that made it through that gauntlet. And we would kind of just go out and find friends, and it wasn't a membership group, nobody was paying a membership fee, it was just people that we know that had raised their hand as, you know, I'm interested to do these types of transactions. And so the one that I was just describing goes like this, and they kind of, you know, either equity or convertible debt, and we provide the charitability memo. And I'm happy to share a template of what that looks like for anybody here that's interested. But it goes way above and beyond and really helps bring down those kind of perceived regulatory barriers in the 3rd bucket. So that's, and that helps them claim that as a PRI. And we still have some folks that are doing this even while we're in phase 2, which I'll get back to in a minute. So foundation PRI is relevant. As we got going, we found a lot of foundations have policies that are like, we don't do PRIs. And as we're establishing the charitability of these companies, like these companies will not launch without us. No one else is going to support them. And yet they hold promise for gigaton scale CO2 equivalent emissions reduction. So just to pause for a moment on impact. To avoid the worst consequences of climate change, we need to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions by 70 gigatons annually by 2050, and all wind power ever deployed in the world is equivalent to 1 gigaton. So we need 70 times all wind ever. So like, we need these companies real bad, real bad. The climate impact hurdle that we set for ourselves, because we have such a robust ecosystem spinning out early stage businesses like this, is that each of the companies in phase 1 had to promise at least half a gigaton themselves as one company in order to make it through. So there's a lot of things that we weeded out that actually would be very impactful. It just didn't clear our threshold. Okay, that's way 1. Way 2 is that whenever we encountered someone that was like, we don't do PRIs, we're like, this is so silly. We're a nonprofit. We know that this is charitable, and so our very lovely attorneys helped us learn about what a recoverable grant is. And in our space, I think for different cause verticals, you could design this in a number of different ways, but for us, supporting this type of company, this for us looked like a 15% annual interest rate loan that only comes due when the company exits. And so we would re-grant that to the company as a recoverable grant. And it's very grant-like because it's subordinated to everyone else in the capital stack. It's pari passu with common. So it's the last thing to get paid back. It's very helpful to these companies in the early days. And it feels like you're on the journey with them, even though you don't own a piece of the company. So this was phase 1. We worked with 54 different philanthropic organizations from 2014 to 2018, and we supported 10 of these companies. So, yes, sir.
What was the average investment in those 10 companies? What is the range of it?
Yeah, so in phase 1, the 10 companies, the rounds that we participated in ranged in size from $500,000 to $6 million. Our part of that round probably, I would say Prime's part was, somewhere from, if it was $500K, it was all us, to $2 million for each company. And without us, the whole round wouldn't happen. So in most cases, just the presence of us being there helped crowd in other types of investors. And so I'm very happy to talk through some case studies from this phase on how that happened. And our first investment closed in June of 2015, and so we actually have some good case studies of how these companies have progressed since then and what their follow-on fund rounds look like. Maybe we'll come back to a case study about that in a little bit. So this is phase one.
So you have a lot of undeployed promised capital, it sounds like.
So
if you talked about $250 million, and at most this is 20 million, but it's less than that because of the range.
Right, so let me get to phase two.
Sarah, the percentage between the program-related investments that went directly and the recoverable grants that have to come through an intermediary, what was that sort of breakdown?
Yeah. So when we first started and we called ourselves program-related investment makers of energy,
right.
We thought that everybody was going to do this.
Right.
I would say in phase one, probably 75% of people did this, and only the real cowboys did this. Because this absolves the philanthropic asset owner of any regulatory risk. Right. And if you're actually doing it in the spirit of a grant, this should be a really nice option. And you don't have to do anything different than a traditional grant, right? In terms of bookkeeping, there's no separate section on your tax form at the end of the year, like there is for a program-related investment.
Cool.
Shall I to phase two? Okay. So toward the end of phase one, many of our philanthropic partners started saying to us, we really don't have the bandwidth for you to be coming to us one company at a time. It's part of why we like working with you, is that we don't have the in-house capacity to evaluate what you're putting in front of us. We already think of you as a fund. Will you please put together a fund? And so the Department of Energy in the same moment came out with a grant opportunity for those that wanted to form vehicles to crowd in private sector participation for early stage neglected energy entrepreneurs. And so
is that DARPA?
It's from the Department of Energy's Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. It's a program called Innovative Pathways. And so starting in 2018, we designed a fund that is structurally different than, I'll use blue for disregarded entities and red for non-disregarded entities, because I think this crowd will appreciate the precision. So this is the Prime Management Company. And we have the Prime Impact Loan Fund. And we have the Prime Impact Equity Fund. And the nonprofit status envelops all of the blue parts, which is meaningful. And so now any foundation, donor advised fund, individual, or corporation has many different options on what to do here. They can make a traditional grant here, and we can make a recoverable grant here. They can make a recoverable grant here. They can do a program-related investment loan here. And then we had some people that surprised us, just individuals. Or in one case, the Sierra Club Foundation has an endowment carve-out that is set aside to be concessionary or take on disproportionate amount of risk. And they came to us, this is why this entity exists. They came to us and they were like, we don't care about the tax deduction, we just want to participate. And so we had to set up a new entity for tax reasons for them that could accept non-tax deductible participation, even everyone well knowing that this whole thing is designed to be charitable. And so we started fundraising in January of 2018 for this. Our goal was to have line of sight to 10 million on an envisioned $20 to $40 million seed fund. And thanks to courageous, very brave parties that participated in our first close in October of 2018 at 20 million, we today are at 29 million. And we have pretty direct line of sight to the full fund target of 40 by the end of 2019. And so phase 2 for me on our path to phase 3, the blended pool, is really the proof that philanthropists will show up in the tens of millions of dollars so that we can imagine how they would work hand in hand with the market rate asset owner community to do things together that neither can do alone, but the fiduciary community doesn't believe me. So phase 2 is really an important proof point on that journey, and I'm just incredibly grateful to organizations like CACF that came in, and I think you all did the recoverable grant. That's right. Here, I'll write the words. The grant. PRI loan.
I'll echo what you said in that this structure makes it easy for a donor-advised fund and a community foundation to participate. So, so the structure makes it easy, and then also the resources that you gathered around you in terms of professional expertise. So my first question is, what's the legal ramifications and how do we handle this from an accounting and tax, are we getting ourselves in trouble? Which is part of my job, is to make sure we stay out of trouble. And you had the expertise readily available, and you actually encouraged us to go pursue that. And so I had numerous conversations with those folk who, held our hand and took us through all the details and provided assurance to me, which I in turn shared with the foundation, that this was, on the up and up, and it had been proven. And the recoverable grant notion makes it pretty easy.
Are those people in-house with Prime?
Yes, and so from a team perspective, I'm employed up here, and I have 2 colleagues up here with me. And I should say, the way we talk about our nonprofit programming now is that we have 3 programs that we run. The first one is facilitating charitable investments, and that's everything that we've talked about here. The second is improving climate impact assessment in our space for very early stage companies that are not yet deploying product in the field. It's very difficult to try to estimate their emissions reduction potential years into the future. So we have a whole program just around that that we're working on with a whole slew of government agencies and other impact investors. We're actually, in that program, we've been peer pressured into taking the way that we do it in-house at Prime and turning it into a software tool that will be made available to the field as like an open source thing online later this year. And then the third is field building. So it's coming and doing events like this where there might be other cause verticals that might want to learn from what we've set up, and we're sharing our legal documents, which we do openly with anybody that is interested, writing publications about the mechanics of what we're doing. So those are our 3 programs, and those all are kind of managed by my team up here. We also manage relationships with our operating grantors. So we're funded, this team is funded by traditional operating grants, primarily from government agencies or very large institutional foundations.
Rick, was your question about the experts, like the accounting and
you were
legal
dealing with.
Expertise? Are they within your firm, is what his question was?
Right, so at the Prime Management Company, we're a few of the people that you talked to, or could have talked to. These are investment managers. Their job, they come from the traditional investment community, and their job is to do all of the deal sourcing, due diligence, structuring of terms, sitting on boards, and to answer any investment-related questions. And then outside of our organization, we have 2 law firms that we work with. One is a nonprofit attorney that we keep on call. It took me about 7 years to find someone with a lot of experience in this space. It was Tomer. And then we have just a pro bono general counsel. And so during our, so this team is available to help kind of educate new to recoverable grant parties. This team is available to help new to venture investing teams. And then this nonprofit attorney avails himself to talk to any party imagining participation in the fund to learn more about exactly what you've got going on and any questions you have for yourself that might relate to private benefit. We have a lot of parties now that, like, some family offices will have a direct investments team, a donor advised fund, a foundation, and a wealth manager, and we have some parties that have participated out of 2 different pockets, and they want to check and make sure that that's on the up and up, and so we provide time with all of these people to help make that happen.
So my conversations were with a nonprofit attorney. I mean, I did have conversations with the investment folk as well that were in-house to Prime, but this gentleman, Tomer Inbar, was invaluable. And we're actually trying to get him to come down and speak with us. He's very willing.
And then
very willing.
we ran that through our council as well, I'm assuming, or have we done that? We then ran the conclusions, or did we not have to worry about it because it was a separately invested fund?
Because it was a recoverable grant,
yeah.
We did not go through our own council.
Yeah, and that's part of kind of why we designed it this way, because structurally, legally, it's the same as making a grant to a nonprofit.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha.
There's just some nuance around it.
I might have to go back and double check. I may have spoken with Michelle McKinney.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. But if it's grant-like, then yeah, we're making a grant effectively, or they're making a grant. We're checking off on a grant. Yeah, cool.
So you talked about the capital gap for these early stage, that there was a real need. Is the field getting more crowded? Is that gap diminishing?
This gap that I'm in our vertical, in our niche little space, this gap is only going to get more and more acute. It has to do with, like, it will only widen. It has to do with the evolution of traditional venture capital over the past century. With the advent of, like, Bay Area unicorn type companies like Instagram and Snapchat, it is becoming increasingly difficult for 10-year closed-ended venture funds to make the argument to support a company that has hardware, capital intensive, might take longer than 7 years to really get to market, when their opportunity cost is trying to find the next billion-dollar unicorn. A lot of people kind of cast blame. It's like the structure of that asset class. And in fact, on Prime's investment committee, we have 20 firms represented like that, and these are people that went into that field wanting to make a difference, and so they're overjoyed to have this volunteer engagement where they can bring their expertise and bring the things that they find personally most exciting, that they would love to follow on to once it reaches a certain milestone or the timeline has been shortened. They just cannot convince their partners to do it right now. And I'll give you a sense of how acute it was when all of the world leaders were in Paris for the global climate agreement. I think that was 2016. So Q2, Q3, and Q4 of 2016, there was $0 of initial investment into anything flagged as clean tech in the U.S. It's this really, really bad problem that not many people know about. And so we keep data about those capital flows. Of course, the public information is missing some things because family offices don't have to share their details, so we know that some activity was happening, but zero, just as a signal, and when I say initial investment, it's like first dollars into early stage companies. It's a serious problem.
Some UVA donors got burned earlier than that, investing in clean tech, and it wasn't the right time, and so that's probably also why all those dollars were pulled out.
There's a whole confluence of reasons why this is happening, and the kind of clean tech venture capital 1.0, a lot of people came in as LPs into very traditional venture structures, a 10-year closed-ended fund that tried to take on kind of hardware intensive, very long technology development timeline companies that just do not fit within a traditional venture.
But MIT for a long time has had an incubator set up, right, with a fair amount of money behind it.
So MIT has a whole number of things. They have an energy venture course that spins out businesses. They have the Martin Trust Center for Entrepreneurship. That's kind of across all areas of entrepreneurship. Just recently, they set up what is kind of like a venture fund called the Engine. It is specifically focused on hardware companies. It's cause agnostic, but it is longer than a traditional venture fund. So I think it has a 15-year time horizon.
So I would have thought that these incubators that are popping up at different universities would have filled some of that gap.
Yeah, so in my mind, there's two things you can do. You can shorten the time horizon that it takes for an innovator to go from invention to commercialization. And I think incubators, accelerators help with that. The other is to actually support parallel development to help them do it faster, to accelerate it. And in our space, we now have over 200 what we call pipeline partners at Prime. So every incubator, accelerator, business plan competition, government granting agency, university center that are spinning out companies like this, most of them send information about their businesses to us because they are finding that it's a bridge to nowhere.
Okay, got it. So you're like the next step.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you have colleges or universities as participants directly in Prime?
We don't have, I think because this is a kind of grant mechanism at Philanthropy, we don't have any universities that have participated. However, what's been really interesting is that as we were getting started, we had colleagues from large institutional investors like university endowments, sovereign funds, pensions, insurance companies that started coming out of the woodwork to say, we would like to place more of our market rate capital into climate infrastructure. Can Prime help us do that? And we said, we've been custom built to help philanthropists, but we did take on a research project to help stand up a public benefit corporation that now operates out of New York called the Aligned Intermediary that has a number of very large institutional asset owners as members. Church of England, Wellcome Trust, the New Zealand Superannuation Fund, TIA, CREF, they're all members of this group, and they come together to do much later stage, much larger, but climate-oriented infrastructure together. So we've had like a little bit of touch points with that community through our standing up the Aligned Intermediary.
Is it, following up on this conversation, what you said, is it fair to say that at this stage that most of your investors are coming from family funds, private individuals, as opposed to what we would think of as public endowments and those kinds of things? And even in our case, am I correct that we were actually flowing through a donor advised fund?
Correct.
And one of the things that I actually mentioned to Brennan that I'm trying to think about is, in a way, we have two kinds of businesses. We have a private business where we have to satisfy an individual donor. But then, in a sense, not legally, not technically, but we're sort of a very exposed public program as well, where people are expecting certain kinds of due diligence, et cetera, in investment of our general pool. And I guess what I'm trying to understand is, is that more difficult for us to politically decide to do as opposed to taking a donor advised fund where we have all the parties that we can touch base with and say, we're in this with you, as opposed to having people invest in a general pool and find that some of it is going to help me find some examples of where you dealt with that. Does that make sense?
I can give you examples visuals of specific companies as we've seen them progress. So let me come back to that. Before I do that, let me draw the picture of phase 3, because I think this is where it could get very exciting for both parts of your organization. So in phase 3, and between us girls, we have a large institutional foundation that has invited a proposal to us for a one-to-one match on our whole phase 2 fund. And so, by the middle of this year, we could have $60 million of catalytic capital, which would close out our phase 2 $40 million fund and anchor what the catalytic side of phase 3. Which is what I'm about to draw. And so we thought that this was going to be kind of a 3-year, nice, luxurious research process, but we could be there sooner than it for very good reasons. So the dream is for Prime to have a blended equity pool where 30% of the capital comes from the community of donors that we've been talking about so far today. So we call this the catalytic side. And the other side, 70%, comes from parties like university endowments, your investment pool, parties that care to be aligned with the values of their, in your case, private side clients. But really have fiduciary responsibility to make prudent investments. Our mathematical modeling in our space shows that by working together hand in hand, and you can imagine for any one company's journey, pretend this is kind of seed, Series A, B, C, D, that in the earliest stage you would draw primarily on the charitable side, but you want to have just a little slice of the fiduciary side, so you're buying low. And then as the company proceeds, they're probably raising more money, but the proportion of charitable capital that you need becomes less if it's achieving. And then you can imagine at some point you graduate from charitability, and now this really kicks in. And you probably have you want co-investors in each round, of course. And in this model, this side is protected from down rounds and pay to plays so that you can continue to advocate for the applications that are most impactful, the higher likelihood of achieving your impact goals. And this side, because you were in early but didn't have to shoulder the disproportionate amount of technical, finance, regulatory, market risk, the math works really nicely, and you have a much higher likelihood of achieving upper quartile venture type returns. And so this is the case that we're going to be making in the next couple of years. But like I said, the whole vehicle together needs to be $250 million. And so we needed to prove that we could get this corner to show up at the scale that's required to fulfill this vision. And so that's why we are just really grateful to CACF for helping us do that. And this is when, wouldn't it be nice to come to CACF and be like, any of your donors that are excited about making a difference in this area can do disbursements into this product, and you from your investment pool have the opportunity to be in this product, and you're working together and everybody's running in the same direction, and there's appropriate protections for everybody, and there's a nonprofit that's making sure the use of this capital is all on the up and up, and this is the utopia that I want us to live in. And so this has played out a bit for, I'll give you the case of our very first investment in June of 2015. It's a company called Quidnet Energy. It's an idea that came from a Saudi Aramco engineer. He had done all of the computational modeling in his nights and weekends, and he wanted to run a pilot test to prove out the idea of using spent oil and gas wells to do pumped hydro storage. And so pumped hydro is the most ubiquitous form of grid capacity energy storage on our grid today. It's where you kind of lop off the top of a mountain, you have a pond at the top, you pump water up the hill into the pond during times when you don't need electricity, and then you just drop the water back down to turn a turbine to generate electricity when you need it. It's really kind of easy mechanical engineering. The problem is you can't do it near where the places you need to dispatch electricity. You can't lop off the top of a mountain in downtown Manhattan. But it's really cost effective. And so what this geophysicist, Howard, thought to do is, he's like, why don't we turn that on its head and pump water down hole? These holes are already drilled because oil companies did that. They're just no longer producing hydrocarbons. The oil companies have a desire to use these assets that are just sitting there. And it's a recycled problem, so you just need one set amount of water one time. And if you pump it down hole under pressure, you take the pressure off, the water comes shooting back up out of the hole and can turn a turbine. So it seemed like a crazy idea. No venture investors were willing to pay for the one pilot test that he needed to run to prove that it wasn't crazy. And so in phase 1 mode, we syndicated 4 philanthropists. The Sorensen Impact Foundation came in directly as a program-related investment directly to the company. The Will and Jada Smith Foundation came in through us. They were our very first recoverable grant. We had an anonymous donor that came in to us as a grant, and then we had an individual that didn't care about the tax benefit that came in. And so with that money, the pilot test went great. And no venture investors were willing to pay for it because you could have wasted $1 million in like a couple of hours. Nobody wanted to take on that binary risk. With the data from that pilot test, we were able to raise a seed 2 round where 50% was from the prime philanthropic investors, 50% was from market rate investors. We ran 47 more pilot tests, crushed all of the technical milestones, were able to raise a seed 3 that was 80% fiduciary investors, 20% prime investors. That recruited a very professional kind of industry veteran CEO, and then he was able to go out and raise a Series A round, $7 million, 100% market rate investors, co-led by Breakthrough Energy Ventures, which is the kind of Bill Gates, Jack Ma, Jeff Bezos, billionaires venture fund, and Evoke Innovations, which is an oil and gas syndicate in Canada. And so that's the story of kind of graduating from needing philanthropic support that we'd like to see over and over. And the really exciting part from our perspective as Prime is that the state-of-the-art battery company that this company would be competing against for a grid capacity energy storage project, they just bid into the same project, and the battery company came in at $9 million, and this company is going to build it for less than $2 million. And so it's kind of an order of magnitude less costly, which is the way that we see, without subsidy, nothing, just make stuff cheaper. And so it could be really, really meaningful for putting more intermittent renewables onto our electricity grid. You really need grid capacity storage to do that. That's one case study of how this has played out even before phase 3.
So how far are you, so those original 4, the Sorensen and Will and Jada Smith, have they been able to recycle those philanthropic dollars yet?
No, so for our types of companies, these are really long time horizon. What's been really interesting is in the seed 2 round, part of the 50% kind of market rate investors were an angel syndicate called Clean Energy Venture Group. In the Series A, they were like bought out of their shares, and so they had very competitive returns over a pretty short time horizon. That doesn't always happen as a secondary sale, but it has happened for us that one time, and the journey for payback is going to be different with every company. But these are generally like very long time horizon investment.
I have a very basic question. Our group of beneficiaries of our fiduciary investments is quite large. How do you educate these people?
That's such a great question. I would put the question back to you, and when we're approaching this phase where we have this product, I would love to come back and like sit down and talk together about what we together see as a way to educate fiduciary investors. Because we've been exclusively on the charitable side of the house, we've learned a lot about, you know, what kind of education philanthropists need, but education of fiduciary decision makers is a whole new territory for us. So may I come back when it's time to help do that.
One thing that I think is helpful in today's world versus 10 years ago is that the newer investors, the millennials, are looking for impact in everything that they do. This is a way of showing impact in what you're investing in. And that's really the education is, do you want to invest in something that really doesn't have impact or has negative impact versus something that has direct impact? And showing those linkages between, you can get into this at all kinds of different levels. What Sarah is showing is kind of taking that impact philosophy and how do you roll that out that makes sense. But there are market rate funds out there right now that have way more impact than some traditional investing does, that you can get into that are deemed traditional almost at this point. They weren't 10 years ago, but there's all kinds of ways of changing our portfolio to be more impactful for an organization. It's just a matter of doing the due diligence and finding those appropriate investments.
Yeah, a number of one thing that we have found as we've built our community, and like I said, it's not a membership group, so nobody's paying to be a part of it, it's just they're doing transactions with us, is some of our tribe are like Diane described, and they have really put in a ton of work to mobilize their whole portfolio, from grants to recoverable grants and PRIs to, you know, all of their whole spectrum of fiduciary investments. And so we've really taken advantage of that at Prime by doing peer-to-peer learning. Just on the philanthropy side, I imagine that there's a lot more of that could be done also on the fiduciary side. And there are membership groups that convene around that, like the Mission Investors Exchange, and in our space there's a group of family offices that gets together called CREO, Clean Tech, Renewable, and Environmental Opportunities, that we partner with in different ways. But
are there community foundations that we could talk to?
That's a good question. I think community foundations can be a member of Mission Investors Exchange. I think a number of them are.
Pretty sure.
Yeah, but we at Prime I think we've done now transactions with just 12 different donor advised fund sponsors, and CACF and the Boston Foundation are really two of the very first that we ever worked with. And I was telling Jan earlier, it's been really nice to work with community foundations, and I think Prime's model could certainly be replicated for things that are, our cause is global, but there are lots of things that you could design similar things that benefit just your region, and so I see community foundations as a really important part of that.
Oh, that's where I was heading, actually. Do you see the community foundation as the prime in that example for the region, or the development of a separate entity?
When we did our very first transaction with a community foundation, it was the Boston Foundation, probably just because they're in our backyard and we had a lot of their donors in our town kind of hearing about what Prime was doing. I had the same question that you just asked, and so a director of donor services from the Boston Foundation came and sat in on our board meetings for a whole year to try to answer that question. I think there's something special about a community foundation partnering with a nonprofit intermediary that can be like your cause expert in a very specific thing that is well bounded, and to build, like an investment committee just around that thing.
And then
you don't have
they're
to
doing the due diligence.
They're doing all the things, you
The
want like a
risk
prime
mitigation
equivalent of, and for all the reasons that we found, it makes the community foundation's role easier, and you don't have to try and hire in-house to be an expert at everything. That would be very difficult.
So that is what I'm trying to wrap my head around, and what I had talked to Jan about. I had talked to someone who had a DAF to understand if it would be possible for them to give us a loan to seed our loan fund. And part of what I was wondering was, do they have the authority to do that? But I thought that it could work because they've already received the tax benefit, and so I was talking to them specifically about that, but then wondered if we could have that partnership with the community foundation, because there are community foundations in other communities, and I wouldn't have to have the personal relationship everywhere. And so my question, I've got a lot of them, but I think what I'll ask is, with these recoverable grants, do people expect a return? Do you structure it to get a return, or just to recover the principal amount? And in our case, where we can expect that there is going to actually be a loss, that we're going to not get 100% of our loans repaid, is there ever a circumstance where the full grant is not recoverable? Like if you know that you can expect 25% loss?
So I'll give you the lawyer's answer and then the business strategy answer. So the lawyer's answer is that no primary purpose, if you are doing anything on the disbursement side of the house, is something that counts as a grant, or if it's a PRI, counts towards your 5% payout requirement, no primary purpose can be financial returns. That said, if you don't necessarily, and this is like a bugbear issue for me, PRIs have become synonymous with concessionary financial returns. It doesn't have to be the case. As long as you're taking disproportionate risk that others are unwilling to take, you can have competitive financial returns. So that's like the lawyer side of the answer. The business strategy side of the answer is, we always say to people, your opportunity cost is a negative 100% financial return if you're making a traditional grant. So, you know, if you make a negative 80% financial return, you're a pretty terrible investor, but you're a really smart philanthropist. If you can grant $1 even like 1.1 times, that's wonderful. So I think it's then just making the case about what's the right fit instrument for your type of lenders, and well, more so for your type of recipients of the loan.
Another way of doing it is to get traditional grant funding that is not expected to be paid back as a portion of that grant fund to cover those losses.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. I mean, that would be such a easier in terms of scale to think of raising that portion versus.
I will say the hard part is the education of the asset owners that you would then go to. Most grantors are not as sophisticated as Blue Moon, and like they will have these same questions. Yes. They'll be like, why would I do a low interest loan or a loan guarantee with you when I could, you know, X, Y, Z, and you'll just have to have really good answers.
Well, and if it's leveraging the ability to get the other, okay.
Yeah. And what we've found across the like 90 some organizations that have now either done deal by deal transactions or come into our impact fund, the people at those organizations follow along a very wide spectrum of like where they want to be inside of your question.
Okay. And so final thing is, if how familiar would community foundations be in general if someone came to talk to them about recoverable grants? Are we on the cutting edge here in Charlottesville?
In my experience, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think of the donor advised funds that we've worked with, only 3 are community. It's Boston Foundation, Silicon Valley Community Foundation, and Charlottesville. And they were driven by donor interest, donor advised funds saying we want to do this. That's the case for any donor advised fund that we've worked with. Even, you know, we've now done a number of transactions with Fidelity Charitable, Vanguard Charitable, a small boutique firm that's, you know, like custom built to do impact investments called Impact Assets. But in any case, it's always driven by the donor.
And so that's what I would love, is to see if there's the possibility for it to be foundation driven.
I think it's a real opportunity for leadership. I think it's complicated to figure out how, but it's like the Wild West, and those designing the products, like would of course love to have partners at the sponsor level rather than having to go find like every single donor. just makes for a very
Well, I'd be
tricky
happy to
sales
help
cycle.
us be pioneers.
Any other questions? Let me look at my list of questions from Jan. Oh, we have 10 minutes left. So we didn't really dive into impact measurement too much. I can say a little bit about our Crane project. So Prime, for our investments, both before we make an investment decision, because climate impact is one of our key underwriting criteria, and then after we make an investment, both for reporting and for the evaluation of our investment managers' performance incentives, it's really important that we are incorporating like quantitative climate impact assessment into everything that we're doing. And so in-house, we have this calculation that we do for every company that we look at called an emissions reduction potential calculation, ERP. And up until now, we've had kind of like a squadron of super smart grad student type fellows that do that for us, and it's very labor intensive. They have to be, an expert enough at that set of potential applications for each company. We just did one for a company that's doing synthetic biology that has a number of like really complicated chemical applications that are precursors that would replace fossil fuels and petrochemicals. And so luckily, like you, we're based in a university town where people like that are abundant, but they're still, it's still kind of expensive and time consuming for us to find them, onboard them, pay them to do these calculations for us. And we do it because we are an unabashedly impact first fund. But we think that other investors would probably do more of it if it were less labor intensive and costly. And so that's why we're taking on this project called the Crane Carbon Reduction Assessment New Enterprise. So we're now 3 months into a 15-month development project to take our ERP methodology and make it available to many others. And so we use it in our diligence before we make an investment decision, and then we set climate impact milestones for each company we support that drive toward that very large greenhouse gas emissions reduction impact that we want. And our investment managers' carried interest are gated by achievement against those climate impact milestones. And so if they're sitting on the board of this synthetic biology company and they decide they want to go this direction and make the newest material for, the coolest lacrosse sticks ever, then and they're not doing, fuels from non-fossil fuels, then our investment manager wouldn't get their carried interest. They have to kind of help steer the ship toward the climate impact that we desire. And if the company decides to go in a different direction, then we would exit. But it's really important to us, and I think that's a really important structural difference in being an impact first fund.
Please, go ahead.
Take me one step further. Let's use us as an example, okay? We have a donor, we've cooperated with them, we have found a vehicle to accomplish what they want and we like. As you said, these are long-term plays. There is a responsibility, it seems to me, to stay in touch with that. And are you doing that? Or are the individual, should our donor advisor feel the responsibility to see that ongoing oversight?
So again, we have kind of a spectrum of what the donor wants. Some of them really love being in touch with teams.
And it would depend a lot on what proportion, how much they got into.
Exactly. And as you can imagine, a lot of our early partners are themselves self-made technology entrepreneurs that really understand the journey of an innovator. And so many of them have a lot of value to offer beyond their financial investment to these companies. And so in deal by deal mode, this happened naturally because we would, as soon as a donor was interested, we would essentially just introduce them to the entrepreneur to kind of come to terms. For those that went through us, in deal-by-deal mode, we provide quarterly company updates to all of the participants. And if you're a direct equity investor, you're getting the reports that you would like any other kind of direct angel investment. And then you're in direct touch with the entrepreneur in as much as you and they want to be in touch. And then in the fund mode, we now, for CACF, will receive reports from Prime Management Company twice a year. And for us, that'll include the financial reporting that you would be used to for any private equity fund. It'll include an operating update about each company, like what's the lily pad that they're on now and what lily pad are they trying to get to next. And it will include a progress report from Prime, the nonprofit, around how they are tracking against their climate impact milestones. So it's kind of like a 3-part report. And then these donors, and I hope that y'all can make it, we're going to try and convene them in person once a year. So that meeting's happening on October 16th in Boston. You might be busy. So that's kind of what's happening here, and then I would imagine something similar. And you know, even the donor that did this from CACF himself is an entrepreneur, so he's busy, so he doesn't like as much contact with the companies. But we have other donors, even if they're in the fund, if they tell us that they do want to talk to and be in touch with, you know, the founders of these companies, of course. Yes, these founders need as much help as they can get.
It's helpful.
Yeah. Great.
Sarah, I can't thank you enough.
That's great.
So,
Sarah's wonderful.